All right, thank you. I hope everyone had a nice lunch. In the third part of my talk, my tutorial about challenging security assumptions, I want to address a very different kind of assumption. So we've already seen assumptions having to do with the behavior of systems that have important implications for cryptography. We've seen assumptions about whether we can securely implement even basic systems, which has terrific implications for the security of electronic voting. In this third part of the talk, I want to talk about assumptions we make about what is easy or hard to see, what we can measure in networks. And I want to introduce, and this is actually the first time we're speaking publicly about this, some new work about internet-wide measurement that's going to appear at Usenix Security next month. This is some things that we've been up to in my lab. If you're a researcher or someone working in industry who is interested in problems of internet-wide measurement, what's actually going on in the real world in this wonderful heterogeneous network we've built, I think this talk is going to have some things that might be very appealing to you. So, over the past several years, we've seen a growing frequency of studies that take advantage of large data analysis for security. Nadia Henninger, in her talk on Sunday, spoke at length about work that a project she led that I participated in with my students, looking at weak keys on the internet, looking at what can you learn if you study the set of all the RSA and DSA public keys that are used for SSH and HTTPS at internet scale. And the answer is you find a lot of really interesting problems. Before that, in 2008, in 2010, the Electronic Frontiers Foundation conducted another very large-scale study about the behavior of the HTTPS certificate authority ecosystem, looking at the set of all HTTPS certificates to ask questions like who signed for them, where is trust coming from, how can trust be violated by people who want to do monitoring of otherwise safely encrypted data. This was, again, based on large-scale scanning of the internet. Connect to every server that's serving HTTPS and see what certificate it presents. We only have to go a little bit farther back to find the first study in this category in modern times. The first study to do internet-wide measurement based on any kind of active probing was in 2008. This measurement study, which is often referred to as the Visible Internet Study. These guys probed every host on the internet using something called an ICMP scan, just basically to see how many hosts were out there, to ask some very basic questions about it. And they reported that they were the first people to try this methodology since the early 80s, when the internet was young and much smaller. So I think, first of all, it's fascinating to think about what we can learn by examining the internet as a whole, by trying to measure every system connected to it in some way. It's also amazing that you can do this with modern networks in an active way, that we can make a connection to every public IP address and ask a question, ask the server a question. Are you serving HTTP, HTTPS, SSH? If so, what's your key? That computers are fast enough to do that at internet scale is absolutely amazing to me. On the other hand, if you look at what it took to do each of these studies, there's some truly heroic effort involved on the part of the research teams. 3 months for the initial study that was doing only very, very basic probing. 3 months on 3 machines to do the EFF SSL observatory data collection. Or in our case, we wanted results more quickly for the P's and Q's paper, the weak keys study. So we used 25 EC2 instances to, in parallel, probe the whole internet. It still took 25 hours to get results out of that, and there was a lot of preparation involved for that. So in each of these cases, you need either a long time or a large number of boxes. The data you get by the time you're finished collecting it will already be stale because the internet has changed since you started. In any case, for legitimate researchers, this kind of this level of effort is a huge barrier to doing work like this. On the other hand, for illegitimate researchers, if you, say, have a botnet and want to find new hosts to infect, you can scan the whole internet for that. You just have every one of your bots probe hosts at random. You'll eventually hit everybody. It's very easy to do. So there's this asymmetrical playing field between what legitimate researchers can do for these studies that have been that are very well known now, and what the bad guys can do, which is much easier and cheaper for them. But what if? So what if internet surveys didn't have to require this kind of heroic effort for legitimate researchers? What if you could scan basically what the EFFSL observatory did in 3 months, or what the P's and Q's study did with 25 EC2 machines? What if you could do that, say, twice a day, or even more frequently, from just a single box? Probe everything on the internet and get back a response. What if the most basic thing you might want to do, just a port scan, see what computers are up and listening on a certain port, took less than an hour from a single box? What if performing a scan was as simple as just a single command line argument and didn't require your grad student or your assistant to spend, a month coding before the study could take place? Well, today I'm going to introduce a tool that's going to be available soon that makes all of this a reality. And this is a tool that we call ZMap. So the ZMap project came out of the Mining Your P's and Q's Weak Keys study, where we tried to do things the old-fashioned way and realized there must be a less effortful way to do internet-wide scanning. So in that study, we used Nmap. Who here has heard of Nmap, the network mapping tool? It's a wonderful piece of software. Nmap is one of my favorite tools. But Nmap is designed for probing a small amount of network space really thoroughly. If you want to know every port that's open on this box, everything interesting on this subnet, every potential security hole in this company, Nmap is the tool for that. But Nmap was not designed for internet-wide scanning. What if we started from scratch and just threw out everything we know from Nmap and similar programs about how to do port scanning and started from scratch? What would we do differently? We also observed that Gigabit Ethernet, which is becoming increasingly common. I don't know how many people in Israel have gigabit pipes to their desks, but it's the standard connectivity at my university now. Gigabit Ethernet is becoming commonplace among research institutions. And Gigabit Ethernet, if you do the math, you look at what it takes, what the smallest interesting packet is, maybe 40 bytes. There's a lot of overhead in the Ethernet protocol for small packets, but if you do the math, divide the size of the address space by the line speed of Gigabit Ethernet for small packets, you see that it's theoretically possible to send one packet to every IP address in only 42 minutes. Can we make that happen? Can we, with standard hardware and software, without going to heroic effort, drive a Gigabit Ethernet connection at line speed for this purpose? We find that yes, we can. In ZMap, we've built a network scanner that can scan at gigabit line speed from a normal box that you probably already have, with a normal NIC you probably already have, and can scan from a single host the entire internet, a port scan for one target port, in about 45 minutes. And can see, with a single packet probe, we estimate about 98% or slightly more than that of everything you would see with a more thorough probe. Okay, so I'm really excited about this. I hope people who are familiar with Nmap also see the potential. But let me tell you a bit first about how we built this tool and what's different about it compared to the way scanning has worked in the past. So starting from this idea that we want to build a scanner that's specifically designed for internet scale scanning, for scans that are maybe 1% of the internet to 100% of the internet rather than just a single /24. We made a series of architectural choices that are optimized for this. One is to start by optimizing the probing process. So we're going to make some assumptions along these lines about what kind of network you're on, what kind of networks you're probing. One, we assume that you have enough bandwidth. If you're going to run this tool, we assume you're not on a cable modem, right? You had better have a 100 megabit uplink to the internet, or a gigabit uplink to the internet, or a 10 gigabit uplink to the internet. And we're going to assume that you're not going to saturate it with your machine. Nmap, by contrast, is designed to be used by anyone, anywhere. It does a lot of work to try to estimate how much bandwidth you have and back off. The tool I'm about to present to you, if you don't have a good network, you're going to kill your network. So make sure you use it carefully. We also make assumptions about your ability to saturate target networks. And the assumption that we make is essentially that you want to scan a random sample of the internet. And if you divide, if you send packets to targets in a random order, a random permutation of the address space, no link between you and any hosts you care about is going to get saturated from that as long as you're scanning at gigabit line speed or below. So this is another assumption about the sort of the topology of the network and the provisioning of distant networks. It's basically a statistical assumption, but we make use of it in the design. Another observation is that if we want to support gigabit line speed, that turns out to be about 1.5 million packets per second. 1.5 million hosts per second you're going to be probing. That means if you want to have a long enough timeout to allow distant hosts that are slow or bogged down to respond, based on our measurements, we get we have to wait something like 8 seconds to get 99.9% of the packets we're ever going to get back. So if we want to have a timeout on that order, we have to find some way to eliminate per connection state, because we're going to have something like ordered 10 million connections, TCP connections in the establishment state at any given time during the probe. There's no way that your kernel is going to be happy about that. There's no way that you're going to be able to sustain that if you have to be maintaining a lot of state for every one of those connections. So we make several choices that I'm going to tell you about next to make it so we don't have to store more than maybe 1 bit per connection. Finally, the style of scanning that we're adopting here is what I like to call a shotgun style of scanning. This is sort of like in DNA sequencing, shotgun genetic sequencing. Basically, basically do it all at once in little pieces and handle what comes back by throwing more computation at it. We want to do something similar to that. We want to do something that's going to give us good enough results that the researcher is going to be able to use them, but not try to be absolutely perfect at the expense of massive blow up in the cost. So, for instance, to that end, we don't bother with retransmission, period. If something is dropped, it's dropped. But the rate of packet loss on the internet as a whole is less than 2%, according to other recent work. As long as we're not causing additional congestion, this is going to give us a very good, although slightly biased, sample of what's out there. So if you want retransmission, just operate it twice. Just operate it in a mode where it takes twice as long and you get back the extra 1 or 2% that you would have missed otherwise. The observation here is that 99% or more of hosts for any particular port are likely to be unresponsive or negative responses to whether that port is open. So you're going to be wasting most of your time anyway by doing retransmissions. Most hosts are going to be filtered and never going to respond. So you basically double your time anyway at internet scale if you're going to do that. We don't bother keeping around all the state you would need to do that. Okay, so what do we do? One thing we do is we've optimized the system for probing random permutations of the address space. So we do basically the simple natural thing to do in this case if you want to do it with very little state. We pick a random permutation by basically iterating over a multiplicative group of integers modulo a p. This is a simple way to represent a permutation of the whole address space with negligible state. We only have to keep around 3 numbers to make this happen: the primitive root, the current location in the permutation, and the starting point, so we know when we've wrapped around. You want to do less than a full sample of the address space. You want to do 1%, something like that. We just do the basically the prefix of the permutation. Very easy. Now, to validate responses, here's another way where our goal of getting rid of state comes in handy or comes into play. So let's say we're doing a SYN scan, a TCP SYN scan. We send a SYN packet to a host. We see if we get an ACK packet back from them. We have a problem, though, which is if we're not maintaining any state, we don't know which hosts we've probed yet. We don't have stored around on our side any of the normal distinguishing features of the connection. If a ACK packet comes back to us, we don't know whether that came from one of our probes in this scan, or it's a delayed response from an earlier scan, or it's just a random packet that came to us, or whatever. It's part of some other process the user is running on the same machine. We need a way to validate that incoming responses are responsive to our probes without storing state. Well, turns out there's a very related problem where we've solved this already, and that's with denial of service attacks against TCP connection establishment on servers, where there's the very elegant solution called Syncookies due to Dan Bernstein about maybe 10 years ago. We do something quite similar to that. What we do is we store in fields like, say, the SYN initial sequence number that we're going to send to the server. We use that to encode basically a MAC of critical features of the connection, like the sender IP address and the current iteration of the scanner. We can then validate that information because that information is reflected in the response coming back from the server in its initial acknowledgement number, for instance. That should match, that should be 1 greater than the initial sequence number that we sent to the server. So we can use basically state that's inside the connection, that's stored in the network and in the remote machine to validate that its responses are belonging to connections we're trying to establish. We don't have to maintain any of that ourselves. We also go to great lengths to try to make, to engineer the way we're transmitting packets to be as fast as possible. Since this is the bottleneck, 99% of stuff is never going to come back, something like that. 90% is never going to come back. So the bottleneck is in sending packets. And there, we try to do everything at as low a level as we can from user space on Linux. So bypass the kernel TCP IP stack entirely. We're just going to write out raw frames to the Ethernet card via a raw socket. We can use a buffer that we update in place to do this, basically trying to eliminate as many CPU instructions, as many cycles as we can for each packet we're sending. We have measured right now with the scanner as it is today, if we skip the context switch on the machines we're tested on, we're getting maybe 20 million packets per second. With the context switch into kernel space, we can do maybe 2.5 million. This is a very, very well optimized part of the code. So remember, Gigabit Ethernet caps out at 1.5 million. So we're much faster than your line speed for probably everybody who wants to use this today. On the way back in, we're using libpcap to process packets. And libpcap has a very bad reputation for being inefficient and dropping packets and all of this. We find it's just good enough for our purposes here, because again, this is maybe a very small fraction of the outgoing traffic is causing packets to come back in. Then in the design of the scanner, what we've done is we've tried to provide a modular framework that lets you, for whatever application you're targeting, plug in code you've written into the appropriate places. Say you want to do a different kind of probe. You want to probe for some UDP service like UPnP vulnerabilities. You replace one function, a handful of functions that generate and validate the packets. We handle the rest. Or you want to send your output to a database directly, to Redis, to some statistics software, to something that's going to do follow-up work like connecting to the server and downloading saving the HTTPS certificate it presents. You can do that by writing an output module, which is another kind of pluggable interface here. We'll take care of the hard part, the thing that's been the hard part in all of these previous studies, which is doing an efficient internet-wide port scan, and let you get down to the work of filling in those couple of modules that let you customize it to whatever research application you have in mind. So next, does this actually work? So we're trying to do something fairly ridiculous here, probing at this kind of rate. You'd think that either we're going to have most of our packets landing on the floor and they're never going to get to the targets, or we're going to cause radical problems for other people on the network, or something horrible is going to go wrong. Otherwise, people would have been doing this before. So here's one experiment we did, trying to figure out whether we could max out the network. And these first couple of experiments, they're really dependent. Some of these experiments are, of course, dependent on the networks we're using to test it. And unless noted, these are going to be done at the University of Michigan, just on our normal office network in the Department of Computer Science. Your mileage may vary. Please repeat the experiments. Repeatability is good. So to measure how fast we can scan and whether we can see a limit to that, we tried scanning the same sample of the IP address space at different speeds ranging from very slow, 1,000 packets per second, that'll take a few months to complete for an internet-wide scan, to as fast as we can, basically 1.5 million packets per second. And there's some amount of variation, but it's not correlated at all with the rate at which we're scanning. There's no threshold at which the rate of things we get back, the number of positive responses we get back from hosts, drops off as an indicator that most of our packets are being dropped. So far, so good. What about how much coverage we're getting? So are we, by sending only a single SYN packet to remote systems, at risk of losing a massive amount of what we would otherwise see by doing retransmissions, doing a more thorough scan? If that were the case, if we were losing stuff, then we'd expect that by sending multiple probe packets, we'd see more. But eventually, we'd expect that we're going to be pretty close to 100%, and throwing even more probes at each machine, even more retries, isn't going to get us any additional things. So we expect to see a plateau somewhere close to where the ground truth is about how many systems are out there and would potentially be responsive if there were no packet loss. And indeed, we do see such a plateau. Again, this is a big, noisy system, the internet, so there's some amount of variation. But we see a plateau that gives us some basis to estimate ground truth. And based on the level of that plateau, we can estimate that with one packet, we get nearly 98% coverage, nearly 90% of what we would, 98% of what we would get by sending as many SYN packets as we ever cared to. With 2 packets, we get almost 99%, and with 3, about 99.5% of what would ever come back. So this, I think, validates this shotgun scanning technique, at least for studies that can handle a very, very small amount of, say, bias in the result, because you're going to be biased against systems that have very poor connectivity. All right, so let's do a quick comparison with some previous studies, in particular with the EFF SSL Observatory and with the mining P's and Q's papers. So for another work that we did, we basically reproduced the same data collection task to say we want to connect to every server on port 443, and if it's offering an SSL certificate, we're going to record it in a database. So this is the task that we set out to do. It's basically the same thing the previous studies were trying to do. So one thing we find is massive growth in SSL deployment. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but you can see that the number of HTTPS servers has nearly tripled in 2.5 years since the SSL Observatory study. So the internet, in particular, this part of it has gotten larger. Despite that, we're much, much faster. So it takes us using the ZMap tool. Well, it took the SSL Observatory, again, 3 months on 3 machines. Took the mining P's and Q's paper team, which is us and Nadia, 25 hours on 25 machines. With ZMap, we're talking about 1 machine and 10 hours for this whole process of probing everything, connecting to every responsive host and downloading the certificate, and then post-processing the certificates. So that's about 65 times faster than the mining P's and Q's paper in terms of CPU hours, and about 650 times faster than the SSL Observatory project. As a result of this, we can do probes much more frequently. So we could do twice a day an EFF SSL Observatory study. What we're in fact doing is we've done a scan of and collected every HTTPS certificate on the internet once every 2 days for the last year. So we have an incredibly huge corpus of this stuff over time, which is a great source for all kinds of questions you might want to ask about the SSL ecosystem and the use of public key crypto. We can also compare more directly to Nmap, which was used for the past 2 major studies that involved this methodology. Nmap is actually very hard to profile well because it tries to adapt to network conditions, and so repeatability is difficult. Getting it to give accurate numbers is hard. It has a bazillion configuration settings you can tweak. We tried to be as fair as possible to Nmap by trying to find the fastest possible settings we could, starting with its most aggressive scanning profile, which is labeled insane, and then building on there to make Nmap be even more aggressive in using our network. Even so, the fastest we could get Nmap to go would have taken 62 days to scan, to do an internet-wide scan. And if you wanted to use it in its default mode, which allows a retry, it would take almost twice that long. ZMap by comparison, and these are actually on a slow old box because one of my grad students was away at the time we did these measurements, but ZMap, so this would be closer to the 45-minute number I said earlier otherwise, but ZMap on this slower older box took about an hour 10 minutes to do would take about an hour 10 minutes to do a single packet probe across the whole internet, or about twice that if you want to do 2 packets to everything and basically do more than a retry. So if we normalize coverage, if we want to ask how much did we see, how many live hosts were there, oddly, we're doing better than Nmap with retries, even without retries. So you might wonder why that is. That's really surprising, and here's why it is. The reason is that Nmap, even though it does retries, it has to have a fairly aggressive maximum response time, a fairly aggressive timeout. in order to not have its state, the amount of state it's keeping around, completely explode. And if we do this experiment where we're measuring, this is a CDF of how long it took to get a response from every server that responded to an HTTPS probe of the whole internet. If you wait up to 10 minutes for anything to come back, how long did it take to get a response? We see that it takes about 250 milliseconds to get 85% of the responses, about 500 milliseconds to get 98% of the responses, and about 1 second to get 99% of the responses you're ever going to get. Nmap's default maximum timeout is about 250 milliseconds, and so I think that explains the lower coverage that it sees, the about 80% of what ZMap would see. With the ZMap architecture, we can wait forever. We can wait as long as you want. We just throw out packets and see what comes back. Since there's no state, we don't have to worry. Now, what can we do with it? This is the exciting part. I've told you sort of the parts that are fun if you built the system. Now, if I've convinced you it can be built and it works, what can we do with it? Well, so one thing we can do with it is get visibility into complicated distributed systems like the DNS infrastructure, the SSL infrastructure. I told you we've been running SSL scans every couple of days. Well, based on that, we've been doing, in a separate project, something that's tracking the CA ecosystem. So this can be the basis of, say, a new kind of defense against rogue CAs or compromised CAs. Things like the DigiNotar Certificate Authority compromise. So one thing we can do is observe everything we see that's signed, look for signing behavior that, by whatever metric you want, is not typical for a particular CA, and then flag and investigate cases where we observe unusual CA behavior. One very simple metric for unusual CA behavior that it turns out lets you eliminate a large number, or at least track a large number of the CAs that are authorized to sign keys for that any browser will trust, is just looking at the top-level domains in which that CA has previously signed. The vast majority of CAs have only signed signed certificates for domains in a handful of top-level domains, either because they're regional certificate authorities that only operate in a certain country, or they're corporate certificate authorities that only sign subdomains of a particular corporate domain, or even they're private certificate authorities and don't really sign anything in public except maybe the company's website. So that's a very, very simple metric with data like this that you can apply to find potential cases of rogue CAs. We can also see very simple things like who are the large CAs that are responsible for most signing, or some of these companies too big to fail. Well, probably. GoDaddy controls 31% of the market as of a couple of weeks ago in terms of number of certificates signed. You can see that Startcom, which is the leading Israeli CA, is starting to get up in the listings there. So shout out to Startcom. We also found, using the same data, a couple of interesting cases of certificate authorities that probably should not, cases where companies where certificate authorities issued sub-CA certificates. So a certificate authority, it's able to sign certificates vouching for the identity of websites. They also have the ability to issue certificates to other certificate authorities and make that trust transitive. We found one very interesting case where we came across a server located somewhere in Turkey that was just a normal web server. But the certificate it was using for its HTTPS site was a certificate authority certificate. It had the isCA bit set. That is, that web server, just a normal IIS default page is all you got when you connected to it, had the authority to vouch for the identity of any other website in the world. This is not supposed to happen. That kind of certificate is supposed to be locked up in a vault somewhere. It's not supposed to be sitting around on some server in Turkey that looks like just a normal web server. This was a case that Google last year eventually spotted when someone used that compromised certificate to forge a certificate for a Google domain, and someone's Chrome browser caught it and panicked and called home. So that was eventually revoked, but you know, we probably should have told someone. But this is the sort of thing you can see with this kind of visibility. What else can you do? Well, very recently, in the past year, H.D. Moore did a study looking at vulnerabilities in widely used UPnP implementations. These are things used by devices for automatic configuration and remote control. Probably your computer and your router have the UPnP port open and are vulnerable to these things, but you know, no, don't worry. With UPnP, in this, H.D. Moore found these vulnerabilities that affected a staggering number of hosts, affected tens of millions of systems, and would allow them to be, basically would allow remote code execution on all of these machines. We used, shortly after the vulnerabilities became public, and H.D. Moore worked with the companies that wrote the software to try to get new versions available and tried to get them shipped out, but a lot of these things are embedded systems and take forever to update. So we tried about 2 weeks after the vulnerabilities were announced and disclosed in public to figure out how many systems were still vulnerable to them. So starting from nothing, it took about 4 hours for one of my students to write a module for ZMap that would do a probe for UPnP and send a packet that would test whether a server was vulnerable without hurting it. And then it took about an hour to actually run the probe on the whole internet. This was 150 lines of code. In that, we found about 3.3 million vulnerable devices, and somewhat more than that, devices that had UPnP open at all. All right, that's interesting. We've measured something. Here's the scary implication. Small changes to that packet would have exploited the vulnerability in the same amount of time and compromised that 3.4 million computers. So when you think about the potential impact of the availability of internet-wide scanning, it can help us to understand the problem and how well it's being mitigated. It can help the bad guys to exploit it. How about other things? So one thing we can do if we can scan really fast is we can get very well focused snapshots of the internet and repeat them many times over a longitudinal study to track how things are changing over time. Now, we've done that with HTTPS and looked at a lot of different trends. We have a forthcoming paper at IMC that examines this data in great detail. But this is based on basically 80 scans, each of which reproduces the whole EFF SSL observatory project, but over a period of about a year. So we can find things like HTTPS, very nice, is becoming more popular. It's becoming more popular quite quickly among top websites. This is a very good thing for the health and safety of the internet of encrypted communication is becoming more widely adopted. What else can we do? Well, let's think about something maybe in the censorship resistance category. Something we can do is use this same kind of technique to track and potentially attack things like Tor hidden services. This is what I mentioned in the telex talk this morning, is what Tor is doing to try to prevent the censor from learning where these relay locations are. They only tell the locations to a small number of users. Well, here's one of those assumptions that used to be good, that the internet was huge, there'd be no way to enumerate every IP address and ask every IP address, are you a Tor relay or not? That's not true anymore. So with ZMap, with about 10 hours of work, we were able to build and run an experiment that probed every IP address looking for a Tor relay, and using some heuristics, identify ones that were very likely candidates, which were things if we were a censor we'd want to block. We found about 86% of all live allocated relays according to the Tor relay database. We think that the ones we didn't see, most of the ones we didn't see are due to inaccuracies in the database, things that were since down, rather than due to things that we didn't see. This is amazingly scary if you depend on Tor bridges as your anti-censorship system. Luckily, Tor is already one step ahead of this kind of development. They've introduced something called ops proxy, which listens on random ports and would be somewhat more expensive to scan, but which has other problems. Here's another thing. In this illustration here you can see, during Hurricane Sandy, which took out power in a large part of the Northeast in the US, we decided, well, maybe we can use this kind of scanning technique to measure problems with the network as a whole. So we repeatedly and continuously probed, well, the whole internet to see what would go away. And in fact, we were able to plot places where there was more than a certain percentage of services dropping offline. And you can see it corresponds extremely well to areas that lost power or lost connectivity due to Sandy. So without any prior knowledge of what parts of the world are going to be affected by this, of any special access to equipment on any of these networks, we're able to get very fine-grained resolution information about things like that. What else could you do with this kind of technology? Well, I think an interesting thought is, can you use it for a kind of anonymous communication? So if I want to send one of you a message, let's say we share a key in advance, I'll encrypt it to you and then fit it in a packet and send it to every IP address. So now anyone can see that I'm sending it, but they have no idea who I'm sending it to. If I want to obscure my identity as the sender somewhat, I can just spoof my source address too, and then it's going to be harder for people distant from me to tell who's sending it. But broadcast is possible with the speed networks have achieved already, and I find that really fascinating. Another thing we can do with this kind of data if you're keeping it historically, you can go back and look at evidence of cybercrime that you only learned about later. We've been trying to do this by looking back at certificates that were known to be used by the Chinese APT1 botnet, for instance. The possibilities are really staggering. Okay, so why should you use ZMap as a researcher? If you don't think internet scale scanning and measurement is an interesting enough topic already, if you haven't yet thought of an application where this kind of data would be really interesting to you, I hope you do. But if you decide you do, then is ZMap the tool for you? Well, let's compare ZMap to Nmap in terms of days to scan the IP address space. And remember here, shorter is better. Okay, here's today. Here's the Oakland deadline. Here's approximately the Usenix and crypto deadlines. So if you want to have your paper ready to submit in time for crypto or Usenix, I highly suggest using ZMap. Okay, let me do a really quick demo, show very basic applications here. And I am, let's see, yes. I'm going to SSH here into a server at Michigan. In my lab, where hopefully my students aren't also running ZMap and already using the network bandwidth. Let's say, let's do something simple for now. Let's just start an internet-wide scan for port 443. This is our canonical application. Oh, sorry, I have to be root. All right. Oh, and this is the slow box, I'm sorry. But here you see we're sending 991,000 probes per second in random directions to everybody. It's going to take about an hour at this speed to probe the whole internet. We're getting back about just less than 10,000 hits, ACKs from servers that have the port open every second It's about 97% of the addresses we're probing are responding. Okay, and if we leave this going for an hour, we'll probe the whole world. Let's say we want something simpler. I know. We want to probe on port 8080 to look for open HTTPS proxies. Maybe we want to just use them in order to proxy through someplace. Let's say we want to do a scan of 1% of the internet on that port. Oh, I'm forgetting which, I think that's capital T. No. Oh, no, it's lowercase t. I'm sorry, we changed the syntax. No? I can't believe I have to do this with my own tool, but let's see. Here you can see it has quite a lot of arguments. Oh, capital N, lowercase n, max targets. Can I try that? All right, now I'm going to probe 1% of the internet looking for this. Let's find out how long it's going to take. Oh, it's going to take about another 40 seconds to probe 1% of the internet looking for open relays on port 8080. Again, at almost 1 million packets a second we're sending here. Okay? So let's try one more thing. Let's say we want to find things that are probably printers. So you know network printers generally will listen on TCP port 9100, and anything you send to that port, even just plain text, will get printed out on the printer. Many network printers have the unfortunate property that they either don't have passwords set or have a default password in place. Some of them even keep around images of past print jobs. It's a real mess, but it's something that might be interesting to study. So let's say we wanted to do that, and we want to get the addresses of, I don't know, let's limit it to 10 printers. And I'm going to have it output the IP addresses to the screen here. There, OK. We just probed however many things we needed until we got 10 responsive things and outputted the address. So that's probably 10 printers located in random places in the world. Just out of curiosity, I wonder what would happen if instead of 10 as a maximum, we wanted, let's say, I don't know, let's say we wanted 2,000. Let's see how well this scales. OK, ZMap has started, ZMap is done. All right. So it still took about 2 seconds to find 1,000 printers, IP addresses that are listening on that port. You can then go and connect to them, do whatever data collection or statistics you want to do. Or if you're evil, you hook this up to something that prints out your advertisement or your whatever nasty message on all of them. I think if you were to do that based on the fraction of things that appear to be printers, if you were to do this and connect to each of them and print something, just in terms of the cost of paper, it would cost approximately $100,000 to print one page to everything that is open. So imagining the, both the research potential on one hand and the potential for harm on the other hand, it's really, really fascinating. OK, all right, so that's enough demo time. All right, so there's important ethical questions raised by this, of course. So for one thing, you're connecting and interacting with basically everybody who has a system on the public internet. That's never going to be a risk-free proposition. It's such a heterogeneous network. It's going to cause some problem for someone somewhere. It's going to cause some expense for someone somewhere. There are going to be some people who just feel like it's intrusive. Unfortunately, there is no technical mechanism, no feasible mechanism by which we could ask for permission from everybody who's running a network. before engaging in this. There's no equivalent to the robots.txt file for HTTP. This is, in fact, something that we're really interested in for future work, standardizing some kind of mechanism for people who want to exclude themselves from non-malicious scanning. As it is, the best we can do is try to make it really easy, A, for people to understand that our scanning is not malicious, so they don't have to panic. They don't have to take, they don't have to use it as a reason to beef up defenses. And B, make it easy for people who don't want to receive any more packets from us to make it stop. So we have also calculated, by the way, that the rate at which people get packets from a scan like this, if you're an individual, you're going to get 1 packet. Right? If you're a /24, you're going to get 256 packets over the course of 45 minutes. If you're a /8, it starts becoming more, the rate goes up and so forth, but you're a very large network at that point and are presumably already getting a large volume of traffic. So this is a good property of the randomized address selection. So some things we did besides that, we put up a server on port 80 on each IP address we're scanning from that explains what we're doing, who to contact, that it's an academic project, how to get yourself excluded. We've set up DNS names, reverse DNS names that indicate the same kind of thing. We've been working very closely with our system administrators who are doing a really wonderful job of supporting research in this case, but we've been working very closely with them to establish policies that make sure we're not causing problems for our local network, and that when people contact the university to ask or complain about the scanning, it gets routed to the right place quickly. And we've, of course, honored all requests from people who want to be excluded from future scans by updating a blacklist that's shared by all of our users. Despite these precautions, there have been a couple of incidents that might be informative for people running future scans. The one I want to talk about is this one, where this story appeared in the in a publication out of Washington last fall, shortly after Zakir had, my student, had finished one of those experiments you saw data from about validating the scanner. It says that Iranian hackers took over a University of Michigan computer network during a massive cyber attack on US financial systems last week. And it goes on to say that they then attacked lots of major banks. First of all, the student wasn't Iranian, he was Turkish. And second of all, he wasn't attacking banks, he was sending packets to everybody. Also, he didn't stop scanning on Friday because it was a holy day. He stopped scanning on Friday because he had an exam. This is just some complete nonsense by someone who's looking at like raw packet counts coming out of networks and not actually looking at any of the details. The things that we did caused no interference with any banks, and in fact, they later, eventually, after the university freaked out, had to run a big clarification stating that this was, in fact, not an Iranian cyber attack. It was a research measurement study.
The headlines stayed the same.
What? Yes, the headlines stayed the same, and in fact, the unnamed security firm that provided them with the scoop stands by their initial assessment. So be careful what you read, especially what you believe that you read, especially about cyber warfare. All right, what actually we got back from users? So this is after about 200 internet-wide scans conducted over the course of the year. We only ended up getting responses asking to be excluded from future scans from about 145 users, which is, considering the scale of the internet, is miraculously small. We ended up blacklisting 91 networks as a result of that, about 3.7 million total addresses, which is about 0.1% of the size of the address space. We did get 15 hostile responses from people threatening either legal action or physical violence or retaliatory attacks. In 2 cases, people did conduct retaliatory denial of service attacks, but those were filtered by our upstream provider. We didn't even have to do anything. So some small fraction of people get really, really pissed off, and you have to be prepared to deal with that appropriately and professionally. But trying to be as good a neighbor as much as possible is really the bottom line here. If you can do that, it can be hugely valuable methodology. Things we don't know how to do quite yet are scanning IPv6, which of course has a much bigger address space. I have some ideas, but I don't want to go into all of those yet. Scanning at 10 gig, we think the tool can do it. We're just waiting for the 10 gig Ethernet uplink. Imagine that being able to do an internet-wide scan in less than 5 minutes. Other things like SNI, complicated, but that's down in the weeds at this point. I'd like to conclude by pointing out that we're basically living in a unique window of opportunity right now in terms of internet-wide measurement. The networks are now fast enough to do very high resolution in time, very thorough in space, internet-wide active measurement. That hasn't been true for very long. And it won't be true for very long because IPv6 will be here eventually, and that's going to make it much, much harder. But while we're in this window, I encourage researchers to think about how we can learn as much as we possibly can about the behavior of the network. ZMap is one tool that can make that much, much easier. I hope that this will remove a significant barrier to entry for people who want to do research like this. The tool is going to be available on August 15th when we present the work at Usenix Security at zmap.io. Right. Thank you very much.